Welcome you to our monthly presentation tonight. Thank you for joining us as always. If you're not a member, we do encourage you to be a member and help support us in these types of activities and our museums and all of our programming. We do have a flyer about that out in the hall. And for those on Zoom, you can always visit us at info@arlingtonhistoricalsociety.org and learn or email us there, or you can find us on our website. Before getting to the main event tonight, we've got a couple of upcoming events I'd like to mention. First, our next monthly event is July 11th, and you can either join us here at Marymount or out in Zoom land. And our speaker will be Kevin Vincent, who is on our committee that helps manage the Ball Cellars House. And he leads an annual walking tour of the property that George Washington owned in what is modern day Arlington. He will be speaking about revolutionary Arlington, and we'll be discussing the role that this area played. Obviously, it wasn't Arlington there as part of Fairfax, but what role the area that's modern day Arlington played during the Revolution. More immediately, we hope that you join us on Wednesday, June 19th for Juneteenth celebration and cookout. Arlington Historical Society is co-sponsoring this with the American Coalition of Black Clergy, the NAACP Arlington branch, Challenging Racism, which is a nonprofit, and our friends at the Arlington Heritage Museum of Arlington. This free event will be held at Metropolitan Park in Pentagon City. It's from 4 to 7. Again, it's June 19th, free event, 4 to 7, cookout, fun activities, and it's a celebration of the liberation. So we do hope we see a number of you out there. For tonight's presentation, we will have questions at the end. And if you're online, we've got board member Marty Soydum that will, you can put them in the chat feature and he can ask them at the end. And for now, we invite you to sit back, enjoy a window seat to Arlington's riverfront, brought to us by Roger Mola, an award-winning journalist, recently retired from Air and Space Smithsonian magazine. He's extensively published with more than 1,000 articles in aviation and aerospace covering history, technology, and business. Mr. Mola is also a private pilot with training in a dozen types of aircrafts, which may influence some of the pictures he's picked. He's both a long-term Arlington resident, having moved here in 1983, and a returning presenter from Arlington Historical Society. You might remember his Operation Sky Shield talk last year. Welcome, Mr. Mola, and we very much appreciate your sharing the story of the view of Arlington's riverfront, going back to days of Lafayette's visits to Arlington House, maybe earlier, I don't know, and then through the ages to the modern era. So let's welcome Roger.
Thank you, Dave. Oh, thank you, David. Use of this microphone. I want to open with this photo of Arlington House taken 90 years ago this month. And I want to use that to establish the theme of the 1-hour tour we'll be taking together tonight. And also welcome all of you here to Marymount, and hello to everyone who's watching us in TV land as well. Appreciate that. This view was taken about 90 years ago, before some of the other modern walkways and such were installed. We'll be touring for about an hour along what I call the coast of Arlington, and that is the riverfront, which stretches from just north of the Key Bridge near the Three Sisters Island, as far as to the south of today's National Airport, and where the 4-mile run reaches the river. I chose that stretch elevated places such as hills and towers and rooftops. But for detail, we'll also be spending a good deal amount of time on the ground, kind of a bus tour. And of course, for safety, please keep your arms and hands in the auditorium at all times. So in July of 1824, we had the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette, and I'm not sure if he'd mind if I just call him the Marquis. His full title is Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier de Lafayette. So I'm just going to call him the Marquis. He kicked off the tour that July at the invitation of President James Monroe, and he brought along his son, George Washington de Lafayette, and he had named his son to honor his commander from the Revolutionary War 45 years earlier. And they began in the Arlington, Alexandria area, stayed until around January of 25, and then kicked off a tour of 24 states. Almost everywhere he went, he got parades and honors, and historians also recorded his oral histories of the Revolutionary War at the time. I went to the website of the National Park Service one day. I was looking up a detail, and it gives a quote from the Marquis from his visit to Arlington House at that time. And it said he stood on those steps, looked out on the grounds, and he told Mary Custis that it was the finest view in the world. And it's still a fine view today, but a lot has changed. I got to wondering, what would the Marquis have seen if he visited at other points in the last 2 centuries? He also told Mary Custis at the Arlington House to cherish these forest trees around your mansion, to recollect how much easier it is to cut down a tree than to make one grow. That advice lasted a while, but of course, during the Civil War, most of the forest around Arlington House was cut down for encampments. And in 1900, another 400 acres were given to the Department of Agriculture for an experimental farm. So before we start on the tour, I want to take a look at a couple of maps for orientation. On the left is a modern satellite view of what this stretch looks like today. In the upper left, you see the Three Sisters Island and the Key Bridge, Roosevelt Island, the Roosevelt Bridge, the Memorial Bridge, and this complex we now call the 14th Street Bridge Complex, which is actually 5 bridges. National Airport, and here is where 4 Mile Run meets the Potomac. And Marquis actually stood on the steps in January of 1825, so most of the foliage would not have been blocking him, so he would have seen virtually this entire area. I've gone to the steps and tested it just to make sure, and you can see exactly from here to there. This view on the right, in contrast, we have shaded in pink, and that is the same view, and the areas colored pink were the original dimensions of the Potomac River. In almost the entire stretch, it's at least 2 times as wide. And down by now where National Airport is, it was more than 4 times wider than it is today. All of the area in this entire view on both sides of the river is what the mapmakers call made land. It was something it was created by dredging up land from the bottom of the river or relocating it from everywhere, from other place. So we have a lithograph here from 1838. So there's about 15 years after his visit to give a better idea of how the view immediately would differ versus today. In the center, we have, this is the current site of the Washington Monument, and the river went right up to the edge of it, and here would be the White House. And this was envisioned as the original gateway, the grand entrance to the city. Up here we have the Capitol, and it may not look familiar because the extensions on either side have not been built yet. Over here we have the only bridge from here all the way to the Chesapeake Bay, and that was called the Long Bridge, and that was built in 1808. On the bottom, we have a view taken during the Civil War, and at this point, compare the Washington Monument, it's only about partway built. Here's this spot here, and here's where it was earlier. And you can see that the river still extends and laps up to the beginning of the hill that now surrounds the Washington Monument. So everything we now see, such as the reflecting pool and the Lincoln Monument, is all on manufactured land. Over here on the left-hand,
Yes, go ahead. Let's shrink the screen so people can see it a little better. There we go. Up. There you go. Sorry.
thank you. Over here on the left-hand side, this bridge for orientation is still a feature you can find today. This is where Pennsylvania Avenue meets M Street in Georgetown, right? And you can still see some of this indentation. That extension that went right by the White House was called Tiber Creek. And you see the castle, and the Capitol in this view now has its extensions added. It seems to be skipping a slide. Okay. We have a map, again, for more orientation. This is from 1856, and we show why Georgetown was chosen as a port. These are all depth numbers, and it goes as deep as 28 feet here, but the entire rest of the stretch was just shallow tidal washes and flats. And from here out to here on most parts of the land were only from about a foot to 2 feet deep at most. And it was much wider and much slower, which explained why almost every winter it would freeze. It was not until later on in modern times, when it was narrower and the water became much faster, that the freezing each winter stopped. What we have here connecting Rosslyn, Georgetown to Washington is the Aqueduct Bridge, and that opened in 1843, and that was a toll bridge. And at this point of Arlington, that was the only way across the river. And it was not for people or horses, it was only for barges. And so you could take a barge from West Virginia all the way into Georgetown, then cross the bridge by barge, and then continue all the way down along the path of what is now the GW Parkway. The aqueduct was privately built, and it was a toll aqueduct and waterway, and it was built by the Alexandria Canal Company with a collections from their local businesses. It came out just to the north of Old Town at the end of Montgomery Street, and today the town has built a replica of where it entered the Potomac River. So let's look at Rosslyn up here from the viewpoint. We're standing here approximately at the top of what we now call the Exorcist Steps in Georgetown. This is how barges would cross the river with space on either side to pull them across, continue in this direction all the way to Alexandria. And one of the reasons they built that was to avoid the ice, because they say the river would freeze nearly every winter, but also to compete with Georgetown because the merchants in Alexandria wanted that for themselves. So here we have two gentlemen looking out from approximately where the Key Bridge Marriott is now, looking at that aqueduct bridge. And here are stone pilings. There were 8 of those piers, and they were kept there for many decades after the bridge was demolished to protect this from ice flows hitting the new Key Bridge. They stayed there right up until 1962, when finally they were blasted away. And the remains are still under the river, and the tops of them are 12 feet below water line. Since this bridge was only for barges, if you wanted to get across and not go all the way down to the other long bridge, you could get on this ferry, very reasonable price. For just a passenger, it was usually just a nickel, and be pulled across to this part of Georgetown. This is at a spot that you can still locate today. It's halfway between Roosevelt Island and Rosslyn. And obviously he was in a hurry to deliver his boiled corn and popcorn. But here's a view from Georgetown looking toward Rosslyn, and you can see that the most prominent point in the upper right-hand corner, landmark that it is what was called the Consumer Brewing Company. And that was there for many decades. This was a photo around 1900. This is the future Rosslyn Circle. At this point, it's all dirt. Over here was the Capitol Trolley Barn where they turn around, come from DC. And you can see that this roadway was now built over the water section. Oops. It's skip some slides again. Wait and see if it catches up. Well, we'll see if we can find them later on. I don't know why it's skipping slides. Sorry about that. This was the Consumer Brewing Company close up. The glass bottles were expensive and needed to be returned. Here they're marked as the Arlington Brewing Company. It was originally named the Consumers Brewing Company. In the early 1900s, they would give out these complimentary bottle openers. Here's an example. You can still find them at auction sites on occasion. Let's see if it transitions by itself. Yes, okay. Here's a map giving you an overview of that area. The Key Bridge finally opened in 23. The Aqueduct Bridge was left standing for the first 10 years and not fully dismantled for almost another 30 years later on. Here's the aqueduct former path, which continued all the way to, to Alexandria. At the time, this was called Anacostan Islands. And you can see in the photo on the right, this was the top surface of the bridge. And now we have an aerial view. Here's Georgetown in the back. This was the former Aqueduct Bridge and the new Key Bridge during the 10 years where they stood side by side. The Consumer Brewing Company, the future site of the Key Bridge Marriott, the Arlington Trust Company, the Rosslyn Circle, where the trams and trolleys would turn around. These are lumber and gas companies. Here now is where we have the famous Sunoco gas station church, which is coming down this summer, by the way. So you'd cross the river, and then you change trains at the Rosslyn Circle to take the number 224 over to the Arlington Cemetery on the Arlington and Fairfax line. So far as I can tell, this very car was later made into a diner. And here it has an attachment on the roof for electric service. The ones that ran through DC did not have that. They used, we'll call it a plow, to connect to underground electricity instead. And we'll look at that later on. Here is the Rosslyn Circle. It would have looked almost exactly 100 years ago this summer. We're looking at Hume Avenue, and to the right it becomes Lee Highway. Here's where they turn around. Here's the passenger terminal. Here is the Virginia Hardware Company. Here is a luncheonette. We have the trolley sack tracks in the middle of Key Bridge, and to their either right are 2 lanes of vehicle traffic. Here we are in 1935, which is the Art Deco design period. I really like this train. We are on 15th Street, right outside the Treasury Building downtown, where you could board for an express to Rosslyn. Their route began near Eastern Market in DC and roughly followed what we now call the Orange Line, except it was entirely above ground. And here they're boarding near the Treasury Building to get to Rosslyn on that train. This has a plow, a metal plow for electricity underneath. And here, once they got to Arlington, they could raise to connect to above ground wires, which were not allowed in DC because that would mar the cosmetics of the DC streets. So here we are entering Rosslyn. There was, for decades, there was always a huge billboard atop the Arlington Trust Company. We have a billboard advertising to drink Washington Senator soda. We have a pawn shop and the Virginia Hardware Company. And this was the heart of the Rosslyn Circle. I like that the same Art Deco kind of design fell to the maintenance vehicles as well. We had these hybrid vehicles all throughout the Rosslyn area that had rubber tires to go to and from the maintenance shed, and then lower steel tires to go onto the tracks. Over here, you see Georgetown University. Here's Key Bridge with tracks in the center and vehicles to either side. Here's a close-up of what was then North Moore Street. And this was 1936, an election year just like this one. And we're advertising to re-elect Roosevelt and his running mate, John Nance Gardner. Here's a Virginia Hardware Company, a pawnbroker. This is the alley next to Virginia Hardware, which was there from 1920s to 1962. And you need to remember this big white wall because it'll help us in a few minutes. So here we are in Rosslyn, looking at an odd scene that was only captioned the Negro Quarter of Rosslyn. That's the extent of it. But we're looking at this family, possibly. These are all houses full of men renting who work for the railroad and for the local gas and lumber companies. Here is the billboard for the Arlington Trust Company, and here is the Key Bridge. And this is right across the street from the Sunoco gas station church. We have an aerial view now from 1937. Here is the circle for Rosslyn, the new Marriott Hot Shops, the Consumer Brewing Company, the house that we just saw, Sunoco, and we have North Moore and North Mass streets. And we have, over here, we have railroad lines and lumber companies and utility companies. This building right here was a major bowling alley. We've got a lot of prominent names. Here's one of the hazards of being right on the circle. This is 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning in 1945. A fuel truck with 5,000 gallons from Baltimore lost its brakes on the bridge, slammed into this milk truck. The driver got out just before it exploded. The driver of the milk truck was in here having breakfast, so no one was hurt, but the entire trust company was gutted. All the burning fuel flowed into the Potomac and set the river on fire. So here we are right out near the doorstep of the brewing company. Here is the entrance to the hot shops to our left, and we're looking at the Rosslyn Circle. We had your choice of a little tavern shop, which was there right up until 62, and then they moved to Clarendon next to Virginia Hardware. And we have the Chicken in the Rough fast food place. We have a billboard up here to buy your Nash automobile. These are train tracks that lead to the rail yard across from the brewing company. And we just turn around on the same corner. Here's the curb, here's the entrance to Hot Shops again. Here's the brewing company, the home of Cherry Smash Soda. They had just put in traffic signals and directions. That was the first year. The Fowler Carbonic Company made gas to carbonate the drinks, or in here there was the brewing and the bottling. During the Navy, all this equipment was used for the Navy to fill their rubber rafts. Directly across from there, this is near the corner of Lee Highway between Fort Myer and Nash Streets. This is one of the 50-ton diesels that used to pull the W&OD railroad train. And of course, that entire route is now bike trails. We'll take a look at a map again. The area we're considering was part of a network of 33 forts from Fort Bennett to well down here. So just above Rosslyn was Bennett, just below was Corcoran. Right here is now where we have Meade Street. Right here is where we now have the Iwo Jima Memorial. Notice how shallow the river is at that time, 2 feet right in the middle of the long bridge, 1 foot there. So all the ships had to go to this bank of the river, just kind of pick their way through till it was finally deep enough in front of Georgetown. So here we are at the Georgetown side, looking at the old aqueduct bridge again. And the Rosslyn Circle is still all dirt in that period. The most prominent figure now on the entire Rosslyn skyline is this figure, which is a defensive unit called a blockhouse. And we'll take a close look to that. That was there to guard the Confederates from reaching Arlington House, because if they got a cannon there, then they'd be able to shell the White House 3 miles away. Here's a close-up of that blockhouse. You could only enter from the 2nd floor, and then the ladder was pulled away. There were no doors, only rifle openings. All of the action was on the 2nd floor. Here is the canal built all the way to Alexandria by the private company. See Georgetown in the background. Here is a scene from Fort Corcoran, as I said, is just next to where Iwo Jima now stands. On the upper left, we have the 4th New York Heavy Artillery and some of the wives and families who lived at the fort. On the lower left, we have the 107th U.S. Colored Infantry. And here we have a New York State militia, and they have 24-pound shells. I put these two photos together because they're only a few steps apart. Here's one of the cannons from one tip of Fort Corcoran, right where the Iwo Jima Memorial is here in this photo being assembled. Here is a sculptor of the Iwo Jima Memorial. This rifle and this rifle are 12 and 16 feet long. It was built over the course of 3 years in Brooklyn, and they brought it in to Arlington, and the biggest pieces weighed 20 tons, and they assembled it here. Here we are in 1954 getting ready for President Eisenhower to dedicate that statue. This is taken from the roof of the Prospect House in Rosslyn. You can see that it's nice and rural on the island. There's no bridge or no connections here. And a lot of these roadways in Arlington are still dirt. Here we are crossing from Rosslyn to what was then called Annalaston Island, later Mason Island, now called Roosevelt Island, same place. So here was the estate house, and it was small rings of trees, but the vast majority was very nicely manicured orchards. At the time, they used a bridge that was pontoon boats lashed together and the wooden walkway on top. And that was effective because of what the river continued to flow underneath it. And that was a problem later on. They had other designs that would block the river. For example, here's a causeway that went right to the surface and below, and the water then stagnated, just like it had across the river. Bred mosquitoes and odors. But here was then Mason's Island. His mansion was here. Only the foundation is now standing, and Route 66 crosses right at this point. The river is nice and deep here, even in those days, but a foot or two later. So here we are looking at an aerial. This is 1959. You can see the entirety. And we finally realized that we've got to keep the water flowing through here, and the bridge is now elevated. Here's Georgetown in the foreground. See how much industry there is in Rosslyn. And now all of this manufactured land covers this entire stretch right down to National Airport and 4 Mile Run. At least 3 presidents visited Mason on that island. Here was his house as it looked in 1890. after it was gutted by a fire in the 1880s. And then there was another major fire in 1906 that was set by vandals, apparently, and it almost completely collapsed. But today you can see that just the foundation is just below where Route 66 crosses the island. Here is an architectural drawing on the left of the time that Mason was living there. Here's his mansion. All of these are very well manicured orchards and formal gardens here for visitors to say, including the president. I call the shape the goldfish. And here it is today, a satellite view. The eye of the goldfish is now the Roosevelt statue. Here is 66, and here's where the mansion stood. For some time, that was a work camp for Black troops that were not allowed to encamp near the white troops. Here's a view from inside Arlington Cemetery, looking toward the river. And now we're seeing the 400 acres donated to make the experimental farm. So these are barns, greenhouses, and really elegant barns all along the riverside from inside the cemetery. This gate is still there, and here's Arlington Ridge Road. They grew 60 types of sweet potato and almost everything else you can imagine. Here's an aerial of that same stretch. They haven't yet finished the Memorial Bridge. These are all experimental farm, the same barns and greenhouses. Here's Arlington Ridge Road. Here's the gate we just saw. Here's Arlington Cemetery here and here. And you can see, based on the air views, all this land is brand new. From here to here is all from land dredged from the river. Now two views, one on top. Here's the view we just saw on top, and below it, in the space of only 10 years, all of this was transformed. Use these bridges for orientation here, and here's the Highway Long Bridge here and here. This is now a dormitory for all the women who came to Washington to work during World War II. And the Pentagon is built, and you can match them just acre for acre. This dormitory held 7,000 women and spanned 28 acres of dormitories. Here's an aerial view of that same dormitory, and they named it Arlington Farms because it stood on the site of the former experimental USDA farm. This cafeteria could seat 2,000 women at a time. They had a beauty shop that had 30 hair dryers. You could rent a single 8x10 room for $24.50 a month, or you could share for $16.50 a month. And it was cheap bamboo furniture. The WPA painted murals in all the hallways and the common areas. Here's another close-up view. Here's Arlington Ridge Road and the cemetery in the background. There was a major bus stop here and a major bus stop here. This was a Navy building, dorms, cafeteria. All of the buildings were named for US states. This parking lot for the dorm is now still a parking lot 80 years later, but it's the garage for the Arlington Cemetery on the identical spot. And right here at this bus stop is the entrance to Arlington Cemetery Metro, right here. For orientation, here's a map of the Arlington Farms at the time with an aerial view of the same thing. Cafeteria, recreation area, heating plant, and now replaced. Here are the dorms and where the Pentagon was built on this lower section. This was a plan as the Pentagon was being drawn. That's why it's the dotted line on it. We're going to keep inching down the river till we reach the airport. Right? Here is the major bus stop along Arlington Ridge Road, and they were meant to last for the duration of the war, so they're called the duration residence halls. And you have pretty women, and wherever you have pretty women, you get sailors. and they would ride their bicycles over, which were free. They were on loan from the Pentagon or from across the river where they had men's dorms. Here's one of the heating plants. Here's the Washington Monument. Men could visit till 11 p.m. In 1946, they finally made that a voting district, and they had to pay income tax for the first time. Oops. So here's an aerial view of the Memorial Bridge under construction. We still have all these wartime temporary buildings. We have a major dredging operation going on in the background, a dredger here and all along here, and they're taking mud from the river and dumping it here to create more than 200 feet of extra land on this side and about 175 feet on this side. And then they began work on both sides to connect the bridge in the middle. The first vehicle over the bridge was President Hoover. At the time, this drawbridge, which they actually call a bascule, was the heaviest in the world at 3,000 tons. And all of the supports and mechanisms to lower and lift are hidden in here, so it wouldn't mar the appearance. And it's all made of white North Carolina granite. So here's the bridge fully completed, and we're in 1943. We still have some of the dorms left over. And from this elevated view, you can see how the plan came together, because it had other choices of where to put the bridge, but the plan was to align it with the center point of Arlington House and the center point of the Lincoln Memorial. And that's perfect done here. It took almost 2 years to put streetlights in. Beyond that, there was driving at night only very risky. So it's further down the river. Last month, you had a speaker talk about Jackson City. This is now the 14th Street Bridge, then the Long Bridge. And here's that term again, made ground. Railroad crossed here. This area in this section became a small set of huts. And it was really not very ambitious, but they thought it was. President Jackson came to lay the cornerstone. Washington Parke Custis came down from Arlington House for the dedication, and it amounted to almost nothing. We had an ambitious plan to hold the first national jamboree on this spit of land, which is now the south end of National Airport. So we set up for 30,000 scouts to come to Arlington. But only 2 weeks out, there were cases of what they called infantile paralysis, actually polio, found in Virginia, and they canceled it. But all these structures were set up. These were all permanent structures, and the boys were supposed to put their camps in between. So these are shelters and cooking facilities. So 2 years later, they moved it across the street. Here we are with more than 25,000 scouts around the Lincoln Memorial. And they held a kind of reverse parade where the scouts lined up for 2 miles along Constitution Avenue, and all the dignitaries drove past them. I'm jealous. I was a good scout. I would have liked to be there. So back on our side of the river, this was the most prominent feature of Jackson City that we just left. We said we're still moving south. Was this racetrack originally for horses, later meant for these cars. And we just had this winner cover the 5 miles in 6 minutes, 7 seconds, blistering speed. This was the famous car number 4. And you can see this track. Here is now the 14th Street Bridge. Here was the beginnings of the Arlington Beach Amusement Park. Again, to orient to the area, here is the racetrack, 14th Street Bridge, Jackson City, the area we were just discussing. And then they began opening airports. That's what you see on the right-hand side. Hoover Field was the first. And this is an aeronautical chart from the 1920s. And pilots were told to look for the roller coaster and the amusement park to find the landing field. Here's the racetrack. And here's another view. We started with Hoover Field, but then right across Arlington Military Road, we had the Washington Airport, and these were arch rivals right next to each other. And here's an aerial view of the same thing. You have the 14th Street Bridge, Arlington Military Road goes right through. Ridge Road goes all the way up here. The experimental farms here. Here is one airport. Here is the second airport. At one of the airports, you could take a flight seeing tour, 15 minutes for $3. If you want to go a bit further, you could take the Washington, New York airline, stop at Philadelphia. A year after those two airports merged, Washington Hoover was the busiest airport in the U.S. They experimented with seaplane service, landing off the Arlington beach that didn't catch on. So here's an aerial view of the two airports right next to each other. One here, Military Road, the beginnings of the Arlington Beach, boat rentals. And here is a hangar for the Goodyear blimp. This waterway is now called the Pentagon Lagoon. There's a problem having a roadway go right through your airport, and that's this. In 1930, the two airports merged. The passenger roadway stayed. They had a nice long runway with the merger, but we had traffic competing with airplanes. For orientation, this intersection of two runways right here is exactly where the center courtyard of the Pentagon today. So here is a photo of cars waiting for an aircraft to cross. Not everyone waited. And worse yet, the road was in terrible condition. So Arlington County says, all right, we'll fix that. And they just put up a sign, road is very dangerous, travel at your own risk. So, Charlie. But there were a number of near terrible incidents, I'll say that. Here we have a early Douglas model of airliner landing only about 50 feet over the cars waiting. They finally installed a traffic light. Here is what was then called the Long Bridge. So again, the 14th Street Bridge now. I bet this guy on a bicycle is going to try to beat that plane. That's just my hunch. On the left, we had boat rental for the Arlington Beach. The model that came after this was the DC-3. I think this is probably the one or. Here is that same type of airplane, and now we're looking at, this is Jefferson Davis Highway taking off. The problem with all of these light industrial places and garbage dumps along Jefferson Davis Highway is that they were allowed to burn their trash, and so the black smoke would always go into the airport, and it would smell. These railroad tracks headed to the Potomac Yard. They would land in both directions, and smaller planes would land from any direction. Again, here's a pair of charts. On the left, we have a chart, and on the right, we have an actual photo. This is a photo taken from 300 feet by aircraft directly over the 3 Arlington radio towers. They were marked on the chart. Here's the Washington Monument, warns that's 555 feet, but the radio tower in Arlington tallest is 600 feet. These two are 450 feet high apiece. And then a few years later, they added another pair that were 250 feet. So those were the most hazardous towers, and they were right up against the airport. So here we have a plane coming in to land. Here's the airport. Here's the wingtip of the plane, and he's only about 325 feet or so. You had to circle really sharp around the radio towers. This is at the intersection of Columbia Pike and Courthouse Road, and then drop about 1,100 feet in the space of about 4 minutes at best, and then land right here. Another close-up. Here are the towers, and they had these horizontal features on top. You can still see the experimental farms in the background. Orientation, the airport is here. Here is Arlington Ridge Road. Here's the cemetery. And he's cutting it awful close again. I'm not sure I'd want to attempt that. I'm going to say between the smoke and the other problems, it was pretty tricky. These towers were disassembled, and they now stand at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, by the way. Another warning to pilots. Here is the Hoover Airport, warning that military planes were a danger, especially under 2,000 feet. Here's the airport. Here's the railroad bridge in the 14th Street area. Problem was just down the Potomac, we had Naval Air Station Anacostia, and they had, between the wars especially, they trained all their students. Here, a squadron of 8, and they come up the river, and then they turn right over the Hoover Airport and then go back. The airport was actually the site, though, of a lot of historic firsts. Here on the left, at the Hoover Airport, we have a test of a form of airmail in which the airplane never landed. They drop a tether, they catch the bag through this scoop, and just keep going. They also demonstrated this auto gyro, and this is about 10 years before the first helicopters. And there was a big crowd watching from the Washington Hoover Airport terminal. Here are two airport photos I put side by side for comparison. On the left, we see the airport here, Arlington Beach, and the intersection of the runways, and that is a perfect X for what is now the Pentagon in the center. This is now the Pentagon Lagoon. This was how the bank of this part of the harbor was done then, and now we've added docks, and this is now the Columbia Marina. You see they match up exactly that way. So let's talk more about the Arlington Beach. The amusement company opened in 23, and it was really quite impressive. It had a swimming area. We had the Yoakum canoe rentals. They had 4,000 steel lockers, so you could come bring your own stuff, put it in for the day. And if you didn't have your own bathing suit, they had 2,500 for you to rent. In the mid-20s, the Moose Lodge brought in 10,000 people for a barbecue, and the Fort Myer Cavalry Band played dance music for them all day. Here's an aerial view of how much you could do there. Here's Military Road. There's the roller coaster, and they call that the bowler dips, and a Ferris wheel, shooting arcades. Over here, you had a parachute drop like you had on Coney Island. This is right near where you have the 14th Bridge now. You had a dance pavilion that could hold 1,000 at once. It was just a great place to visit, and you can rent boats and go swimming at the same time. So here is the warning about driving this road, because here's the airport, here's the amusement park, here's the Goodyear blimp hangar, and here is the boat rental. The sign says, "Military Road, very poor condition, drive at your own risk." Up here, by the way, here's where the Arlington House is. So the Marquis would have seen that. And here is the Arlington Beach in all its glory. Lifeguards sitting on a table. By now, they've installed lights so you could swim at night. They dredged this out further and added a nice diving platform. In 1923, a stuntman tried to dive in from an airplane 60 feet over, but he didn't control the way he fell, landed flat on his back, and he was killed in front of hundreds of families. They didn't allow that again. Well, here are a couple of swim clubs you could join at the Arlington Beach. I like those outfits, you know, young men, young women. And we had a visit that day from the ladies of the B.F. Keith Theater. They were a vaudeville troupe from DC. And here in the background is the arch rival to the Arlington Beach, which is the Tidal Basin Beach. And so Arlington Beach did everything it could to with special events and such to lure people to here rather than to the Tidal Basin. Let's go across the river and take a look at that. Here was the Tidal Basin Beach. And for orientation, this spot right here is now where you now have Stumpy the cherry tree. Right there. But we had men's lockers here, women's lockers here, a viewing pavilion with music here, and right here is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. This is obviously a hand-colored photo. Very popular swimming place to say they did what they could to compete with Arlington. Here's a view from inside that pavilion where they dredged out the tidal basin to allow this huge diving platform, which they advertised as being better than Arlington Beach. Men in straw boat hats watching the action. Again, you got the really fancy bathing suits. I like those. Live music and alcohol for sale in here. This was a whites-only bathing facility. There was a big push to make a black people swimming area across here. The Southern Democrats said, no, we're just going to close everything down. And in 1925, that's what they did. So the Washington airport said, both beaches are now closed, but there's still a demand for swimming. So they submitted these plans to the Arlington County Board in 1932. It was approved for a swimming pool, lunchroom, a peanut shop, and a frozen custard stand. And it was to be the largest pool in Washington and one of the largest on the East Coast. And here it is. Here's the 14th Street Bridge. Here is the new pool, 90 feet by more than 200 feet, 9.5 feet deep, with a water fountain and a slide, and a rooftop for dancing and spectating. And the pool could hold 2,200 swimmers at a time. And they also rented thousands of suits if you didn't want to bring your own. The boys club hired, for one party, they hired 150 kids, cabs, and they brought in 1,700 kids for a party. Okay, and here's a better view. Here is the pool, and here's the airport. The pool was open till 11, but you could tip the band to keep it open all night, and then just rent a swimsuit and stay the next day. So the bars would close in DC. This bar was open all night, and they'd come party here. This was quite famous and infamous. On its opening night, Amelia Earhart was the special guest. So here's the pool, and here's the rooftop hangar bar. And here's a 1940 map given out by Esso gas station in DC. And you got to like that the only thing they said was worth visiting in all of Arlington was the airport swimming pool. We had more competition going on. Arlington was considering opening a campground here because DC wanted to encourage tourism, and they allowed free camping on this side of the river. And they had a camp store with showers and a free shuttle bus to the mall. So right up until World War II, you could just pull in and camp for free at East Potomac Park. So there's the staggering volume of wood meant to build the Pentagon. The Pentagon was being built at the same time that the airports were still operating. So here's the old airport hangar in the background, and here is the Pentagon construction underway. So amazing similarities. Here is February 1942. Here is February 2002. Here we have 4 sides of the Pentagon complete. 1 still working on. Here we have 4 sides complete. 1 is open again, being repaired after the terrorist attack. You can see the 5 rings, A, B, C, D, E, radiating out from the center. The former airport was here, and the women's dorms were here, and this has now all been taken over for construction. And here again, 2 aerial views identical, taken 30 years apart. This one on the left is in 1965, testing a satellite. On the right is the identical view in 2002 after the terrorist attacks. So this side here, and here you can see where the attack took place, but everything else is identical. In this part of Arlington, virtually nothing has changed over 60, 65 years. But you can actually line up everything perfectly. And over the decades, satellite views have been taken from that same spot if you want to do a comparison sometime. Most people know that the Pentagon has 5 rings, but this is a great architectural drawing that was released at the time to show ring A, B through C. What few people know that there's a service road that it starts on this side to enter the courtyard. Underneath were subcellars to store records and computer equipment. And in 1959, there was a terrible fire from the magnetic tape of computers, highly flammable, and the heat was so intense they had to chop away almost the entire set of floors between all 5 rings. And that was the only time it was exposed, between 42 and 2002. So here's General Eisenhower in June of 45. He's coming back after victory in World War II, and they're assembling at National Airport, and they're forming a convoy and parade to make a parade through Arlington. We all got in their Jeeps, and they headed for the courtyard that we just saw, the parade at the Pentagon. This is Marshall, his chief of staff, right here. And here's an aerial view of that very event. Quite a rare photo, actually. You come in through the service road, and the parade circled once and then ended here, 4 remarks. And these are all workers from the War Department congratulating Ike on the victory in World War II. After all the celebrations there, and then a parade along the Arlington waterfront, the next morning early, he flew to New York and got a ticker tape parade, attended by several million. But we got the first parade. So just across from the Pentagon, Route 1, we had the busiest hot shops in the area. At the time, you got to love this, the signs for the Pentagon were in the shape of the Pentagon. This is J.W. Marriott, who went for a promotion in 56. He landed his helicopter there. Car hopped, put a tray on the side of the helicopter, and served him lunch. Someone calling me. So there's always been a bridge in this part of the river. It's just a question of how many. In the early 1800s, it was 1, and later expanded to 2, highway and railroad. And now the DOT considers this to be 5 distinct bridges, and they all have their own names. And they just call it the 14th Street Bridge Complex. It's total of 6 lanes or 8 lanes for traffic between these 2, and then the Metro Rail Bridge, and this is for Amtrak and CSX. For comparing, these 2 photos are exactly 100 years apart, taken, I believe, from a balloon in DC. We're looking from there toward Arlington and the future National Airport. This was the future site of the Arlington Beach, which was right here. This was the future site of the engraving and printing. And you see there's 1 bridge, that's it. And later on, we have 1, 2, 3 here, and then the highway bridge, and then this was the 60s. So the Metro Bridge was not ordered till later on. So here, we finally have the Jefferson Memorial added exactly at this spot. So this was 1862, this was 1962. The Long Bridge has always had similar construction over the last 2 centuries. It's really quite amazing. Here it is around the time of the Civil War, and we have wooden planks for support, and they go horizontally. And during the Civil War, they took the surface off the top and just left these planks so that military equipment couldn't get across. And here we see the modern bridge being constructed almost identically, except across the supporting beams are all steel now. Same place, actually only about they're very few steps apart. So now, a few decades apart, we had the largest pool in the Washington area, just to the left of the bridge, and then the airport pool here. And now today, we have one of the largest pools in the area, just to the right of the bridge. So here's the Long Bridge Aquatic Center and the bridge, and here was the Washington Airport pool. So let's go a little further south. We're heading toward the airport. The airport is on the site of what used to be called the Abingdon Plantation, which is 650 acres. Here's a view from a tourist guide from the late 1800s. Great guide, very helpful for putting together research. Here's how it looked later on, and it was already in bad shape because in the period, it was a common practice for tourists to grab a little souvenir of the place they were visiting. And then there was a suspicious fire, and that was the end of it. Today, the only thing left is the foundation of this house, and it's stuck right here between the 2 parking garages. So here's an aerial of the future airport. This bit of land was firm. There's a firm bank here. This was a semi-permanent sandbank. This was all squishy tidal flat. All of this from here to here was dredged and firmed up to make the airport. So roughly 80% of today's airport used to be underwater. And you see how this used to be 5,000 feet, and now it's quite tiny. Here is the same kind of comparison looking view now from south to north, and you can see the same thing. Here's that firm spit of land where you had the Boy Scouts. Here's that sandbar. And put these together, and now how it looks later on during construction. All of this water was filled in with mud. We have a north-south runway, we have a diagonal crossing runway, and then we have a third runway passing in this direction. We'll talk about later on, we also have a 4th runway, which has disappeared since. Looking further, another before and after, this is in the 40s, and this was 70s. This was the old Arlington Airport Drive-In Theater. Held 850 cars for a drive-in movie. This was a temporary war building. This was the 4th runway, which existed at the time. Here's today's runway 1, 2nd airport, and then the 3rd runway that crosses it. And here you are today. We have now a Gravelly Point in here. Same runway, same orientation, same overall, but you can see, obviously, the drive-in theater is gone. Here was FDR dedicating the airport, and he is shown, they propped him up against the podium so it could appear that he was standing on his own strength. Here is his touring car. And just over here, this became part of the main terminal, which hadn't yet opened. He's dedicating it more than a year before it's actually finished. But over here, they built a special room for him, which is still kind of an historic landmark. I've been down in there, and they had a very early form of accommodations for someone in a wheelchair so he could use the facilities on his own. You can see why National Airport, by the 50s, was considered the 6th busiest airport in the world. Parking has always been an issue. This tower has since been stripped down because it ruins the view from the new tower. People would come to the restaurant to watch airplanes or just to eat, regardless of the flight. It had white linen service and bands and a very good reputation. For most of its life, if you were a pilot coming into land from the south, you'd fly over Alexandria and see this view. You have the cathedral here, Monument, Jefferson, and we still have 3 runways. This main one, one here, and one here. But with only three runways, it's kind of odd that we have this numbered 36. I'm going to share some airport trivia. You can impress your friends. We'll get to that. So this is a pilot's view coming on. Here is a graphic that explains some of it. This is a nice piece of tile work that used to be in the main terminal until they covered over with an ugly floor. But it's still underneath there. It's a compass showing that north is the 360-degree point on a compass. South is 180 degrees. West is 270. East is 90. And due north, 360 degrees, is abbreviated to 36 at airports. So the original main runway at National was runway 36. But the magnetic compass around the world has been shifting every decade. Approximately every 50 to 75 years, we have to redo all of the readings because the magnetic center of the Earth is on a molten plate that's shifting towards Siberia. And so in 1999, the airport was about 60 years old and the magnetic direction had changed, and runway 36 was now runway 10. And runway 3 has now become runway 4. Same runway, new numbers, and it happens all over the world all the time. The original design of the airport had an east-west runway, a fourth runway, runway 27 for 270 degrees due west. Didn't last long because for the first mile taking off and landing, it would have been directly over South Glebe Road. Residents didn't seem to like that for some reason. Here is the airport drive-in theater. And this is just a wartime building. We're getting near the end of our tour. We're down south of the airport now, or almost. This is the monument to military lost at sea. And I'll do a call out to the Goodyear blimp, which has taken some of the photos we've seen tonight. This is near the dedication year, around 33, 34. And it's still here today, a very pretty little memorial. Here is the Goodyear blimp that used to be stationed in Arlington, served here for a few years, then went on to New York, and then during the war, it serves in Pennsylvania on patrol for people to make sure they're complying with the blackout regulations. So they report towns and individuals who are not turning their lights out. So this control car is today in the National Air and Space Museum. You can go visit it. A previous speaker for Arlington Historical Society was one of the crewmen for this blimp, actually. This is one of my favorite aerial views that shows everything going on in 1934, just about 90 years ago this summer. The Boy Scout camp that never came, the blimp hangar, the experimental farm, 2 airports, and the future site of the Pentagon, and the immense pool and the hangar bar, all in one photo. Kind of coming full circle, we had an historic flood in 1936. The Potomac was 18.5 feet over its highest level. And we had thousands of people line the Key Bridge just to watch. There's just a few of them here that had terrible problems with traffic, pedestrian traffic just gawking. And almost the entire stretch of land that we spoke about tonight was back to the original level that the Marquis de Lafayette would have seen 2 centuries ago. And next slide, just to dramatize that, here is the airport. Only the hangars are above water, but not completely. The only dry building in this entire stretch is the airport swimming pool. This was the original line of the Potomac River that the Marquis of Lafayette would have enjoyed. And that's the only firm land, and that's where they had built the railroad tracks. Everything else is made land. So we're now full circle and back to 1824. How are we doing on time? Quarter after, so we have about 15 minutes. I'd like to take some questions, but actually before we do that, I think I see some experts here. I'm gonna try to stump you if I can do that. This is a view taken from a high point over Rosslyn. And what are we looking at here? What is this that we're seeing here? Who knows that? Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what it is. It's the Watergate concert stage. And they began doing those concerts at the Lincoln Memorial in 1935, and they ran them every year till 1965. This stage would be stationed right here on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to hold a concert by the National Symphony all summer. And they finally stopped in 65 when they began jet service international. Was not compatible. Well, that's not, it was there only a couple of days waiting for the time to open this bascule and bring it back. Its off-season home was actually down by the Navy Yard. All right. So here's what that looks like from a very high altitude, roughly at least 18,000 feet. And it was so large, you can see it. It's the most prominent thing on the edge of the river, was that barge stage. And I'd recommend, here it is, an actual concert, and you could buy tickets for 50 cents back here or $1 to sit up close to hear a concert from the symphony. They had finally put in street lamps along the Memorial Bridge. Just for fun, you should rent the movie Houseboat with Cary Grant and Sophia Loren, and they go attend a concert at the Watergate barge stage. Okay, next question. Where is this bridge? This is a harder one. Well, I heard Long Bridge. Well, any other guesses? Well, Anacostia, that's closer. This bridge, it's a little bit outside of the area we talked tonight. This bridge was in existence for only 3 years during World War II. Here's National Airport, here's the Naval Base, here's the Air Force Base. A bridge was built on the original pilings. There was once a Civil War bridge, only to allow guaranteed passage for people from the Pentagon and for troops to get across the river if all the other bridges were bombed during World War II. So the Corps of Engineers shopped for a bridge. They finally found one out in Michigan that was the right length, disassembled it, trucked it here, reassembled it in the Potomac, and it stayed there till early 1946, and they took it down. And if you feel like wandering, you can actually go to Old Town today, go through this little park, and you can see where the railroad tracks kind of turn toward the river and then just disappear in the grass. Okay. You're not doing as well as I thought. I'm disappointed in you. Right? All right, one more. Here is a pool. Where is this pool? Pretty good guess. Any others? Okay. Oops. Oh, it's not showing for some reason. But the pool is right at the base of the Washington Monument. Yeah. It was there from 1923 until the early 30s. And there were 2 pools. One was shallow, just for little kids, and the other was deep enough for diving, and it was well known. There were national competitions held there. And here you have the boys diving, remind you not to spit. And here is the Washington Monument. And this was also a segregated pool. In those years, if you were a person of color, you needed to use the public fountains or just to help yourself to the river. And as our final shot, here is a view of the pools from the air, monument, and they just radiated out. Nice clubhouse, bleachers to watch the swimming competitions. Pool 1, walkway, pool 2, and a bathhouse. And here's the ellipse. And here is the Keystone Bombardment Squadron sending us on a nice farewell. The end. Thank you. I think we had a question from a man who called himself a river rat. Is that right?
I was just trying to look at this stuff, just to see it. I remember a lot of stuff from when I was a kid, like that causeway at Roosevelt Island, and that was still around when I started growing in 1960. Maybe they were just blowing it out.
Oh, that's something.
And they go back with that bridge abutments were blowing out in 1962, and I watched some of that.
Oh, did you? That's great. Did you take photos? If you took photos, I'd love to see them.
What's that?
If you took photos, I'd love to see them.
Just a kid hanging out there. So
Okay. Yeah. There must be some other questions. Yes, yes, sir.
Is Ridge Road between Rosslyn and Pentagon City 110 now?
No, it used to connect all the way from what you now see near the Pentagon City Mall, right across to Rosslyn, but then it was closed in stages. But at the time, you could drive that entire length kind of inland along the edge of the cemetery.
Hey, Roger, if you can repeat the questions, that helps for those in Zoom land.
All right, thank you, Marty.
Yeah.
Marty, are there questions?
Well, I tell you what we've got from the Zoom people is all wows and fantastic and excellent presentation. Everybody is in awe. So excellent. I was fascinated by all your pictures as well. They're really a great show. And we had one person ask if you could flash up your email address. I think he wants to contact you. That was your lead slide. You may not be able to get back to it, or you may be. It's probably just easier to say it.
Is that showing on Zoom?
There you go. You got it. Yes, we can see that now. Correct.
36. Yeah, and there had also been a once in a century flood only about 40 years before that. But this was the worst in the last 150 years or so in 36. Yes, sir. They were not. No, the Hoover Airport was all sod, and it was only about 800 feet wide by about 2,000 feet long. Could only take very light aircraft. When they merged the two airports, they finally paved it. That was not until the early 30s, and then they had one runway that ran about 4,200 feet. But at about roughly the 2,800 foot point was the roadway, and you had to slow down real fast if you had trouble. You know, any collisions? I think I saw a hand over here. I have always loved aerial views, and I just on my personal travel, I always research them before I go to some new country or a new city to get oriented, and that way I can pick out all the landmarks as I land. And it's just a fun hobby. Everything that I've shown tonight is a public domain image, no copyright. However, of course, it takes many, many hours to find them. Anything else? Yes, sir.
You first started out with the Three Sisters Island. I want to know, put the three islands in the river there, and they look like sisters, but did they refer to any sisters, any living body or any sisters?
I don't have the answer to that. Maybe someone else can help.
What was the question, Roger?
I'll repeat the question that the gentleman asked if the Three Sisters Island was named for a particular set of sisters.
Oh.
I think they were, it goes back to the Native Americans, that they had a story about three sisters, and that's how they got it. The three sisters, Native American sisters, I think, drowned under the bridge, so that those islands came up where they drowned. the legend, because that's all I know, and I probably have it half wrong, but that's my fraction understanding of it.
Thank you. Marty, can you hear that answer on Zoom?
Not well. I think you may need to repeat, just to synopsize it.
We heard that it was named for perhaps Native American sisters who were drowned at that part of the river.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Quite a bit. Actually, there's a really rich library at the Department of Transportation in DC. Almost no one thinks to go there. The Martin Luther King Library in DC has a very good collection on Arlington. Not as in-depth on some topics, including DC. I've done extensive research on the airports before, so some of them were from National Archives in College Park. Others were from Library of Congress, some from Park Service, and others from any very wide variety of sources. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes. I haven't, but there are very good records at Library of Congress of the murals and when they were commissioned and who did them. You should be able to find them that way. And it was Works Projects Administration, and they had it was cheap bamboo furniture, but they try to liven it up. The outdoor of them of the buildings were all very military gray, just awful looking. But they had committees to try to pretty up the grounds, and they're allowed to sew their own curtains, but there are a lot of other rules about how to decorate the rooms. They did what they could. Yes, sir.
For, when in your pictures of the building of the Pentagon, you see pictures of Queen City around that?
I have, yes. And for just in the interest of time, I didn't include them here. And I think you've already had a talk on Queen City here for AHS, is that right? Yeah. But I can come back and talk about Queen City if you like. Yes, ma'am. Why he left, I don't know. I know that he sold it eventually, and it was used as an army camp for non-white troops for some time. And then it was used as a retreat for boys in poverty. And then later on, it became more public land. But I can't tell you why he sold it. I don't know. He was a general. I can tell you that.
We cannot hear any of the questions. None. Hello?
I apologize. A member of the audience asked if we knew why General George Mason sold the property, and I could only speculate. I don't have the exact reason.
May I please ask, which year was the Pentagon started and then finished?
It was started in early 1940, and it took, I don't have the exact, I believe it was done well enough to occupy in less than a year.
Thanks.
Question with regard to the two airports, Hoover Airport and the original National Airport, but they were on different adjacent plots of land, and the airport we have now, Reagan National Airport, is on all fill. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, you had the Hoover Airport, and then not long after that, the Washington Airport, and those two became one in the early 30s. And they kept operating right up until the very day that National opened about 2 miles away. And National is on a completely man-made piece of, well, 2/3 of it is man-made land taken from the river. And it turns out when they expanded the earlier airports as well, that land was also mostly manufactured, but it this time didn't come from the river. For Zoom, by the way, the man asked about the location, I think, and the origin of the 3 airports. the land where most of the earlier airports were built was actually land from DC that was excavated to build the Federal Triangle complex of buildings. And they had tens and tens of thousands of cubic yards of dirt they brought across the river to expand the airports. And then some of that dirt later on used. But I say the dirt for National Airport was from the river itself. Thank you again.